In the year 742 of the 41st millennium, I was decanted from the Schola Progenium with a Mordecai's investiture and a posting to the 55th Capic Eagles. I was young, filled with the fire of the catechisms, and eager to serve the God Emperor in whatever capacity he saw fit. The Damocles Gulf Crusade was a worthy furnace for such zeal. I was reassigned to the Brimlock Dragoons in time for the push on the Xenos world of Daleth, and it was there, in the grey dust of a city dying under the guns of the Tau, that my zeal was scoured away by plasma. I remember the sound, not a bang, but a sharp, clean hiss, like tearing silk. It's a sound that still haunts my dreams. One moment I was dragging a screaming guardsman with a belly wound into the relative cover of a shattered hab-block wall. The next, a white-hot fist slammed into my shoulder, spinning me around. Pain was absolute, a clean, searing agony that eclipsed all thought. I remember staring dumbly at my arm. The flak weave of my uniform melted away, the flesh beneath blackened and bubbling. The pulse round had flash carbonized the bone and boiled the blood in my veins. The smell was of cooked meat. My meat. I would have died there, another anonymous corpse in the grey dust, had it not been for Trooper Rost, my orderly. His face, a mask of grime and terror, appeared above me. He was shouting, but I couldn't hear him over the ringing in my ears. He hoisted me over his shoulder, a dead weight, and began to run. The sky was raining blue fire, each impact a sharp snap hiss, another soul sent to the Emperor's judgment. I remember the lurching of Rost's run, the way my head lolled, the taste of blood in my mouth. Then, nothing. The rest is a fever dream of pain and filth. I awoke in the overflowing wards of a base nosocomium on the agri-world of Prefectia. It was a place of perpetual twilight, the air thick with the stench of disinfectant, unwashed bodies, and despair. The groans of the dying were a constant liturgical choir, a soundtrack to my recovery. For months I drifted in and out of consciousness, my dreams filled with the hiss of plasma and the terrified face of Trooper Rost, a man to whom I owed a life I no longer wanted. Just as my strength began to return, I was struck down by the Vraskian scab pox, that bloody curse of our off-world campaigns, likely brought in with a fresh batch of wounded from another front. My fever burned for weeks. By the time it broke, the Mordecai board declared me unfit for continued service. I was so weak I could barely stand, my arm a useless thing of scarred flesh and cheap augmetics that whirred and clicked with every movement. I was a broken tool, no longer fit for the Emperor's wars. They shipped me to Hive Sibellus on the troop ship Orontes. I spent the journey in a crowded hold with 1,000 other broken men, the air thick with the smell of stale sweat and bitter regret. A paternal minotaurium granted me a meagre pension, 11 thrones and 6 scrip a day, and 9 months to find a new purpose before the Adeptus Administratum claimed my life for some menial, ink-stained damnation. I had neither clan nor kin on Sibellus. I was adrift in the great, smog-choked wilderness of the Mid-Spire, a place where a man with a handful of thrones can disappear in 1,000 different ways. The air itself is a thick soup of promethium fumes and acid rain that sizzles on the ferrocrete walkways. The sun is a myth, a forgotten god, its light a dim, perpetual twilight filtered through a kilometer of toxic clouds. The constant, distant wail of sirens and the roar of bulk lifters is the city's heartbeat, a rhythm of endless, meaningless toil. I took a room in a reeking hostelry, my days a cycle of staring at the grime-streaked plasteel window and trying to forget the hiss of pulse rifles in my dreams. My pension dwindled. I knew I had to find a purpose, or the hive would simply swallow me whole. It was on the day I had resolved to sell my Mordecai's kit for passage to some forgotten agri-world that I found myself in the Gilded Saint, a drinking hole where off-duty enforcers and sour-faced spy merchants traded whispers over glasses of amasec. The air was thick with smoke from cheap Iho sticks and the low murmur of 100 clandestine deals. A hand fell upon my shoulder. It was Adeptus Biologus Thrax, a former colleague from the Mordecai Scholem. "By the throne, Vorn! I thought you were a corpse on Daleth," he exclaimed, his face a welcome sight in the gloom. His own robes were clean, that of a man with a steady function, a stark contrast to my own worn and stained fatigues. Over a measure of foul-tasting recaf that scraped the back of my throat, I gave him the short, grim summary of my life since the war. He listened, his expression growing more somber with every detail, his eyes occasionally darting around the smoky room, as if to confirm we were not being overheard. "Poor devil," he said, shaking his head, "to survive all that only to be consumed by this place. What is your function now?" "Leaving," I answered bluntly. "There's no function for me here." My voice was a dry rasp, unused to this much conversation. I took a sip of the bitter recaf. "I intend to sell my Medicae's kit for passage to an agri-world. I hear the air is breathable." Thrax leaned closer across the sticky table. The din of the bar seemed to fade into a low hum. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Function," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "Perhaps there is one. You're seeking a new master, a new post?" "I am," I said, a flick of something long dormant, curiosity perhaps, stirring in my gut. "What is it?" "It is an opportunity," he said, choosing his words with the care of a man handling unstable chems. "A dangerous one. I work now at the Skolem's high security wing, the Genitor Labs. We service special clients. There is an Inquisitor, a brilliant man, but difficult. He had an opening in his retinue." Thrax paused, his gaze intense. "For an acolyte with your exact skills, Medicae training, military experience, especially in the Damocles Gulf. An opening. The world hung in the air between us. In the Imperium, such openings are rarely created by peaceful retirement." "What happened to his last acolyte?" I asked, my voice flat. Thrax took a long sip of his amasec and refused to meet my eyes, instead studying the skull and cog motif etched into the grime on the wall. "He retired," he said, the words carefully chosen. "Abruptly. The position is available. The work is hazardous. The Inquisitor is a tempest, but it is a purpose, Vorn, a great one." A cold thrill, something I hadn't felt since the drop pods screamed towards the surface of Daleth, ran through me. An Inquisitor, a name that was a prayer on the lips of the faithful and a curse on the lips of the damned. It was a name that meant power. It meant purpose. "What ordo?" I breathed. "Hereticus," Thrax whispered, the word barely audible over the chatter of the bar. He glanced nervously at the other patrons. A sour-faced enforcer, a merchant's agent with augmetic eyes. A Puritan, they say, but a radical empiricist. His methods are unorthodox. They call him Blackstone. He shuddered slightly, a genuine involuntary tremor. Inquisitor Mordecai Blackstone. He is looking for a new instrument, Vorn. Someone to serve as his chronicler and his blade when needed. Someone who has seen the horrors of the galaxy and not broken completely. I thought of you." "Why?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Why me?" "Because you are desperate," he said, with the simple, brutal honesty of a chirurgeon. "And because Blackstone values men who have already died once. He says they have less to lose. Shall I take you to him? He is at the laboratory now." I thought of the endless grey years ahead of me, stamping parchment in some forgotten sub-level of the administratum, my soul slowly calcifying into another layer of bureaucratic sediment. I thought of the reek of my hostelry room, a place where hope went to die. Then I thought of the hiss of pulse rifles, the searing pain, the feeling of being alive in the face of absolute oblivion. A choice between two hells. I chose the one with a purpose. "Take me," I said. The ground car Thrax summoned was an unmarked, armored vehicle with no windows, only picked screens showing a grainy, distorted view of the hive outside. The journey was a descent, spiraling down through the transitways from the noisy commerce of the mid-spire to the grim, functional silence of the Scholem district. The air inside the car was cool and sterile. The alchemical laboratory was in a sealed, high-security wing of the Scholem Medicae. Access was granted only after Thrax's ident chip was scanned by a silent, red-robed magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus, his face a blank, impassive mask of bronze. The corridor beyond was cold, the walls made of dark, unadorned plasteel that seemed to drink the light. The air hummed with the sound of stasis field generators and bubbling vats of amniotic fluid, the building blocks of servitors and other less savory creations. Robed genitors and servo skulls glided through the gloom, their augmetic eyes glowing with a cold blue light. Their work was hidden by swirling chemical fog that smelled of ozone and sterilized flesh. Thrax led me to a secluded chamber at the far end of the corridor, the door a heavy slab of adamantium. The room was a chaotic mess of arcane equipment and forbidden knowledge. Specimen jars containing things I could not and did not wish to identify lined the walls. A preserved Xenos limb floating in amber fluid, a human skull with a third empty eye socket, a jar of writhing iridescent insects. A massive complex data loom flickered with incomprehensible streams of binary, its constant quiet clicking a counterpoint to the bubbling of a dozen glass retorts. In the center of the room, a tall, impossibly thin man was bent over a table, his back to us. "Inquisitor Blackstone," Thrax said, his voice trembling slightly. The man turned. His face was hawkish, dominated by a sharp nose and piercing, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything at once. He was clad in the simple black robes of a scholar, but they hung upon him like the robes of a judge. He held up a phial containing a single drop of crimson liquid, holding it to the light with a reverence usually reserved for a holy relic. "Purity," he exclaimed, his voice a dry, triumphant baritone. "I have it. A reagent that is precipitated by the bioparticulate of a gene stealer, and by nothing else." His excitement was not one of joy, but of a predator who had perfected a new kind of bullet, a weapon of absolute surgical precision. "Acolyte Karthus Vorn, my lord," Thrax said, pushing me forward slightly into the Inquisitor's line of sight. Inquisitor Blackstone's sharp eyes fixed on me. They did not just look at me, they scanned me, dissected me, analyzed me. He did not greet me, he simply began to speak. "An Acolyte Kyrogen," he stated, his gaze flickering from my face to my augmetic shoulder. He took a step closer, his piercing eyes narrowing. "Capic Eagles, then Brimlock Dragoons. The reassignment was not your choice. The Capic Eagles are a proud line infantry regiment, the Dragoons a mounted reconnaissance unit. An odd transfer for a Medicae, suggesting expediency over strategy. You were a battlefield replacement." He circled me slowly, like a predator inspecting its prey. "Wounded at Daleth by a Tau pulse round. The scarring on your tunic's collar, though faint, is consistent with the vapor flash of a plasma impact at medium range. The augmetic on your shoulder is a standard munitorium-grade replacement, functional but crude. It whirs at a frequency that suggests its lubricant reserves are low, meaning you have not had it serviced. Therefore, you are short on funds." He stopped in front of me again, his eyes boring into mine. "Convalesced on Prefecture, where you contracted the Vraxian scab pox. A logical deduction. The lingering pallor of your skin is not that of a simple Medicae, but of someone who has endured a prolonged system-wide illness. The scab pox was rampant among the Vraxian refugee camps established on Prefecture after the siege. Your uniform, though clean, bears the specific fine red dust of Hive Sibellus' lower transit ways around the cuffs. Yet your skin has not yet acquired the true grey of a long-term resident. You have been on-world for less than a standard month, and your desperation," he said, his eyes glinting, "is as loud as a Vox Hailer in a silent room. Adept Thrax was right to bring you to me." I was speechless. The air left my lungs. He had not simply read my life, he had dissected it, laying bare the facts of my existence with the cold, impersonal precision of a post-mortem examination. Thrax, standing by the door, looked as if he was about to be physically sick. So, how in the name of the Golden Throne did you know all that?" I finally stammered, the words feeling small and inadequate in the vast silence of the laboratory. Blackstone placed his precious file down carefully on the workbench. "The Imperium is a sea of data, Acolyte," he said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. "Most men drown in it. They see only the chaotic surface. But for one who knows how to look, there are patterns, currents. The universe is a grand cryptogram and everything from the dust on a man's boot to the tear in his eyes is a piece of the key. I observe, I deduce, it is all I do." He gestured around the chaotic laboratory. "I have need of an instrument with your experiences. I am a man of the mind, Vorn. I require an associate of the body, someone to bear witness, to record my findings with a Mordecai's precision, someone whose hand is steady enough to wield a scalpel or a blade when the situation demands it. The work is dangerous, the hours are long. The last man to hold a position failed to appreciate the distinction between scientific curiosity and terminal stupidity." He gestured to a dark, acid-pitted stain on the far wall. "The pay is non-existent," he continued, his eyes locked on mine. "The risks are absolute. Your former life, what little is left of it, is forfeit from this moment. But you will have a purpose beyond mere survival. You will see the dark heart of this hive, and you will help me cut out its cancers. You will be a part of the great work." He stood there, a spectre of cold, hard logic in the alchemical gloom, offering me a choice between a short, terrifying life of meaning and a long, grey one without it. There was, in the end, no choice at all. I had accepted the Inquisitor's offer. In truth, what choice did I have? I moved my few possessions from the reeking hostelry that very evening. My new master followed with his on the next day. A silent stream of hooded servitors bringing in crate after crate of arcane equipment, data slates bound in human skin, and specimen jars containing things that squirmed in the dark. Our new residence was a suite of hab units at Sector 221B Obscurus Lane, a spire level far enough from the Underhive to be considered civilized, yet close enough to feel the thrum of its depravity. By some writ of his authority, Blackstone had requisitioned the entire floor. The rooms were spacious, with broad, grime-streaked windows of reinforced plasteel that looked out upon the endless, smog-choked canyons of Hive Sibellus. By day it was a vista of grey metal and brown, toxic clouds, a world without a sun. By night it was a sea of glittering lights and distant, silent flashes from the spire-top walls of the noble houses, a constant, beautiful reminder of the Hive's endless, casual violence. Once we had settled down, I began to study my new companion and the strange, new rhythm of my life. He was a creature of intense, almost manic energy, followed by periods of profound, death-like torpor he called the Black Bile. For weeks he would be a whirlwind, a force of nature that filled our sanctum with the foul stench of Xenos ichor analysis and the crackle of overloaded data looms. He would work for cycles on end without sleep or sustenance, his lean frame powered by some unseen inner fire. During these times our rooms would be a chaotic landscape of his obsessions. Strange, non-Euclidean artifacts laid out on the floor, detailed anatomical drawings of alien creatures pinned to the walls, and the air thick with the ozone of some dangerous alchemical experiment. Then, just as suddenly, the storm would pass. A reaction would seize him, and for days on end he would lie upon the synth-leather sofa in our sitting room, hardly uttering a word, his eyes fixed on the stained ceiling, lost in some inner void I could not comprehend. He would not eat, he would not speak. The only sound in the sanctum would be the mournful, droning dirges he played on a strange, 9-stringed catgut viol, a sound that seemed to echo the endless misery of the hive itself. It was during these times that the true weight of his knowledge, the burden of the horrors he investigated, seemed to settle upon him. My own days took on a new, rigid purpose. I was his chronicler, his chirurgeon, his quartermaster, and when needed, his man-at-arms. My mornings were spent organizing the chaotic flood of data he produced, transcribing his muttered observations from audio logs, cross-referencing obscure heretical texts with planetary census data, and trying to bring a semblance of order to a collection of data slates that seemed to actively resist it. My afternoons were for the maintenance of our tools. I learned the rites of cleansing for his Inferno pistol, a beautiful and terrifying weapon that hummed with a caged fury. I field-stripped and reconsecrated my own las pistol until the movements were as natural as breathing. The muscle memory of the guard was a comfort in the strange new world of shadows and whispers. His visitors were a strange and often terrifying collection. I learned to recognize the different footfalls on the staircase, the different chimes of the door servitor. There was the quick, nervous tapping of the administratum adept, a sallow-faced man who would deliver sealed data slates and refuse to make eye contact, his body radiating a palpable fear. There was the heavy, floor-shaking tread of the Ogren bodyguard who sometimes accompanied a shadowy figure from the spire nobility, the Ogren standing silent and immense in the corner of the room, his presence a constant, brooding threat. And there were the whispers, the informants from the underhive, men and women with augmetic eyes that clicked and whirred, their faces a roadmap of scars and desperation, who would trade fragments of truth for a handful of thrones or a promise of the Inquisitor's protection. I learned more of the Hive's dark heart in those first few months than I had in a lifetime in the Guard. I learned of spy politics that were as brutal as any trench war, of forbidden cults that festered in the deepest sumps, and of the constant, unending struggle between the forces of order and the chaos that threatened to swallow everything. One morning cycle, while Blackstone was in a grip of one of his black moods, I picked up a data slate from the table to distract myself from the mournful drone of his vial. The title was The Book of Life, an academic journal for those who study the nature of man. The article I read on the art of deduction was a remarkable mixture of shrewdness and absurdity. The writer claimed that by a man's fingernails, his coat sleeve, his boots, a man's entire history could be plainly revealed. A piece of supreme nonsense, I cried, slapping the data slate down upon the table. I have never heard such rubbish in my life. It is evidently by some armchair theorist who is evolving these neat little paradoxes in the seclusion of his study. It is not practical. Oh, but it is intensely practical, Blackstone remarked calmly from the sofa, the drone of his vial finally ceasing. The sudden silence was more startling than the music had been, so practical that I depend upon it for my function in this galaxy. So what function is that? I asked, unable to hide the irritation in my voice. I have a trade of my own. I suppose I'm the only one in the galaxy. I'm a consulting inquisitor. He sat up, the fire returning to his eyes, the black bile receding like a tide. Here in Hive Sibellus we have a tolerable force of enforcers. They are effective instruments of blunt force. They can pacify a hab-block riot, hunt down a sump ganger, or execute a dissident. But when they are faced with a true puzzle, a crime that has subtlety, a heresy of the mind rather than the fist, they are lost. They come to me, and I manage to put them on the right scent. He steepled his long, thin fingers. They lay all the evidence before me, and I am generally able, by the help of my knowledge of the history of heresy, to set them straight. There's a strong clan resemblance about misdeeds, Vorn. If you have all the details of 1,000 heresies at your finger ends, it is an odd thing if you cannot unravel the 1,001st. Proctor Valerius and Proctor Krieg are the pick of a bad lot. Valerius is obsessed with spy politics and the letter of the Lex Imperialis, but he cannot see the spirit of a crime. Krieg is a brute, a fine tool for kicking in doors, but he thinks every problem can be solved with a shock maul. They have their knives into one another too. They are as jealous as a pair of hive gangers. They will be here this cycle, both of them, you may be sure of it. I was still pondering his incredible self-confidence when, true to his prediction, the sharp electronic chime of our door servitor announced a visitor. It was not the shuffling of an informant or the heavy tread of an Ogren. It was the crisp official rap of an Imperial agent. Adept of the Enforcers, my lords, the servitor intoned, his voice a polite, metallic rasp. He bears a high-priority missive. Blackstone gestured for me to open the door. An Enforcer's adept stood in the hallway, his grey, high-collared uniform immaculate, but his face was pale and slick with sweat. He carried a data slate in a trembling hand and refused to look past me to where the Inquisitor sat. The fear of Blackstone's office was a palpable thing. "A message for you, my Lord Inquisitor," the adept stammered, offering the slate. "From Proctor Enforcer Valerius. It is urgent." Blackstone took the slate, his eyes scanning the glowing text. I saw his nostrils flare, just once. A predator catching a scent on the wind. "Ah," he said, a flicker of genuine interest in his expression. A bad business during the night cycle. In the abandoned Lauriston tenements, sub-level Tertius. A man found dead, no wounds. The hab block was empty. He looked up from the slate, a dark fire in his eyes. He requires my assistance. The proctor is waiting in a ground car below, my lord, the adept said, already backing away down the corridor, as if fleeing a predator's den. Blackstone turned to me, his torpor completely burned away, replaced by that familiar, terrifying energy. Vorn, you may come if you have nothing better to do. I have nothing to do, I answered, a thrill of purpose running through me. Then fetch your sidearm, he said, and your Medicaid kit. I suspect this will be a matter requiring a more delicate touch than that which the enforcers can provide. The ground car that awaited us was a standard enforcer patrol vehicle, a blocky grey slab of armor and reinforced plasteel. Proctor Enforcer Valerius, the tall, haughty man from the message, sat inside, his face a mask of impatience. He was the very picture of a spire-born official, his uniform immaculate, his bearing stiff and condescending. He barely acknowledged me, his gaze fixed on the Inquisitor. A strange affair, Inquisitor, he said, his voice clipped and precise. The body of a man was found in an empty, locked hab unit. He is an off-worlder of some standing. There are no signs of a struggle, no wounds, and yet there was blood and a message written in blood upon the wall. And the message? Blackstone asked, his eyes already alight with a predatory gleam as he settled into the vehicle. A single glyph, Valerius replied, his voice low, heretical in nature, unrecognized by our lex mechanics. The mystery was afoot. As the ground car lurched into the flow of transit, I felt a surge of energy I had not known since my days in the Guard. The monotonous grey of my convalescence was finally being replaced by the sharp, vivid colours of a new campaign. We descended, the journey from our relatively clean sector on Obscurus Lane into the grimy depths of the Lauriston sector was a physical and spiritual transition. The smog thickened, pressing in on the armoured windows, the distant lights of the upper spire vanishing into a brown, toxic haze. The air that filtered through the car's scrubbers grew thick with the stench of chemical runoff and nutrient vat overflow. The transitways became more crowded, a chaotic river of battered haulers, rickety auto carriages, and the endless, shuffling tide of humanity. Faceless figures in grey work shifts stared at our official vehicle with a mixture of fear and resentment. I saw a patrol of enforcers brutally subdue a sump ganger, the cracks of their shock mauls a sharp counterpoint to the endless droning sermons that blared from public foxcasters mounted on every corner. This was the real Hive, the grinding, miserable machine that lay beneath the gilded shell of the spires. The Lauriston tenements were a dismal-looking block, a monument to decay, its plasteel shutters sealed and its face grimy with the filth of the Hive. A small crowd of loungers and off-duty workers had gathered, their pale faces upturned, their expressions apathetic but curious. I recognized the grim armored forms of the enforcers, who had formed a cordon around the entrance. A squat, pugnacious man with a scarred face and a bionic eye that glowed with a dull red light was arguing with Valerius as we arrived. "This is my precinct, Valerius," he barked, his voice a gravelly roar. "Proctor Krieg has jurisdiction. I don't need some spire-born fop telling me how to investigate a simple murder." "Jurisdiction ends where heresy begins, Krieg," Valerius sneered, gesturing with a contemptuous flick of his hand at the hablock. "The presence of an unknown glyph elevates this beyond our pay grade, which is why the Inquisitor's here." Blackstone ignored their squabbling, as if they were buzzing flies. "The body," he asked, his voice cutting through their posturing like a scalpel. "Is within," Krieg grumbled, clearly resentful of the intrusion, but powerless to stop it. He gestured to the open door with his shock maul. "Nothing has been touched." We entered. The hab unit was dark and foul-smelling, the air thick with the scent of stale sweat, cheap amasec, and something else, a faint, coppery tang that I, as a Medicaid, recognized instantly as old blood. A single lumen strip flickered erratically overhead, casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel as if it were alive and breathing. In the center of the room, sprawled on the grimy floor, lay the body of a man. His fine off-world robes were disheveled, and his eyes were wide with a look of utter, soul-shattering terror. There were no wounds upon him, no signs of violence, yet on the floor around him, small, dark spatters of blood could be seen. Blackstone moved like a predator. He did not walk, he flowed through the room. A black-robed phantom, his eyes darting everywhere at once, absorbing every detail. He seemed to enter a state of pure, focused intellect, the bickering enforcers and myself forgotten entirely. He knelt, his long, thin fingers hovering over the body, but never touching it. He sniffed the air. He examined the dust on the man's boots. Then he pointed to the far wall. There, scrawled in what was unmistakably blood, was a single, sharp, angular glyph I did not recognize. It was not a symbol from any known cult or gang. It seemed to pulse with a malevolence all of its own in the flickering light. "The fools will say it is a random mark," Blackstone murmured, a strange fire in his eyes. "They will search their data looms for a gang sign, a minor cultist's tag. They are wrong." He turned to the two enforcers, his gaze sharp enough to make them both flinch. "This is not a simple murder. This is something else entirely. Gentlemen," he said, a cold smile on his lips, "this is a study in scarlet." I confess that I was mystified by the Inquisitor's pronouncement. The two Proctor enforcers, however, looked upon him with a mixture of awe and resentment. It was clear this was not the first time his unorthodox methods had overshadowed their own diligent, if plodding, police work. Proctor Krieg, the scarred veteran, was the first to break the tense silence, his bionic eye whirring as it focused on Blackstone. "A study in scarlet, you say? What we have here, Inquisitor, is a dead off-worlder and a bloody glyph. My men are already running the victim's ident chip through the central cogitators. One Lord Enoch van der Est, from the Gudrun's system. A merchant of some kind. We are searching for his script adept, a man named Yorick Stain. The motive, as is almost always the case in this hive, is likely thrones. Simple." Blackstone chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that set my teeth on edge. "Simplicity, Proctor, is often the most effective cloak for complexity. You see, but you do not observe. The distinction is everything." Without another word to them, he began his own examination. I had never seen a being work with such intense, focused energy. He did not seem a man, but a precision instrument, a cogitator of flesh and blood designed for a single purpose, the acquisition and analysis of data. He produced a small silver device from his robes, a data magnifier, and a reel of synth tape from another. With these, he went over the room, crawling upon the floor, sometimes pausing to sniff the very air like a hound. He measured the distance between the blood splatters, analyzed the dust on the windowsills, and scraped minute particles from beneath the victim's fingernails into a specimen bag. His movements were economical and precise, a stark contrast to the hulking, armored enforcers who stood by the door, their impatience a palpable force in the small, grim room. I, with my Medicaid training, found myself drawn to the body. Lord van der Est's face was a mask of utter horror. His lips were peeled back from his teeth in a silent scream, and his eyes were wide, staring at some unseen terror on the ceiling. I noted the lack of any visible wounds, save for a small abrasion on his lip. But what struck me was the faint, almost imperceptible mottling of the skin around his eyes, tiny spiderweb patterns of burst capillaries. Petechial hemorrhaging, a sign of extreme physiological stress. Asphyxiation, perhaps, or something else. Blackstone seemed to read my thoughts. "Poison," he murmured, his voice low, though he was on the other side of the room examining the wall. "But not one you would recognize, Vorn. Not a simple toxin. Something that kills the soul before it stops the heart." He turned his attention to the bloody glyph. He did not touch it. Instead, he produced a small, handheld Auspex scanner, its silver carapace engraved with the eye of his office. He passed it over the bloody mark, and the device emitted a series of soft, inquisitive chimes. "No residual psychic taint," he noted. "So not the work of an unsanctioned psyker. The blood is human, type Gamma Rho. The victims. The glyph itself, a feign, a clever one. It is a minor sigil of vengeance, known to a dozen petty death cults in the Tower Hive. The killer wrote it, knowing your unimaginative enforcers would begin a pointless and time-consuming purge of known cultist dens." He glanced at Krieg. a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "They are chasing a ghost of his own creation, giving him time." Krieg grunted, his hand tightening on the grip of his shockmaul. Blackstone now began to pace the room in a slow, deliberate circle, his eyes scanning the floor. "Our killer is tall," he stated. "The glyph on the wall is a good 2 meters from the floor, and the strokes are downwards. He has long fingernails on his right hand. You can see the faint scratches in the dried blood where his fingers slipped against the wall's texture." He stopped and crouched, pointing the data magnifier at a tiny pile of grey ash near the leg of the table. "He uses a particular type of aloe stick, made with dried Galatian fireweed, an expensive habit, not a common sump-ganger then." He moved to the window, which looked out onto a narrow, filth-strewn alleyway. "He arrived in a ground car with a faulty hydraulic stabilizer on its left side," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "You can see the twin tracks of dripping viscous fluid on the transitway below. One track is regular, the other is a series of intermittent blotches, a unique and identifiable signature." Proctor Valerius, who had been listening with an expression of haughty disbelief, finally spoke. "This is all very detailed, Inquisitor," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But I fail to see how the brand of a man's aloe stick or the maintenance schedule of his vehicle brings us any closer to an arrest." Blackstone turned to him, his eyes like chips of obsidian. "It is because you seek an arrest, Proctor," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "while I seek the truth. You are looking at a puzzle with 1,000 pieces, and you have chosen to focus on the single most obvious and most misleading one. I am looking at the shape of the pieces you have chosen to ignore." Proctor Valerius's pale face flushed with anger, but he seemed to hold his tongue, knowing the precariousness of challenging a member of the Holy Orders. Krieg, however, had no such restraint. "The shape of the pieces," he snarled. "I have a body, a bloody glyph, and a missing scribe adept. Those are the only pieces that matter. My enforcers are already shaking down every sump-ganger den in this sector for information on the so-called death cult." "Then they are wasting valuable time and resources, Proctor," Blackstone replied, his back still to them. "Your killer is not a gibbering cultist from the sump. The ash from his aloe stick is from a brand only available in the upper spire boutiques. The dust on his boots contains trace minerals unique to the Ares of Hivetop. He is a man of some means, or at least one who moves in such circles." He paid them no more heed, and resumed his crawling search of the floor, moving with a speed and agility that was unnerving in a man so tall and lean. His fingers, like delicate antennae, brushed across the grimy floorboards, tracing patterns in the dust. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the erratic flicker buzz of the failing lumen strip overhead and the distant mournful wail of a hive siren. Even the 2 normally boisterous enforcers seemed frozen, reduced to mere spectators by the sheer focused intensity of the Inquisitor's will. I watched, mesmerized, trying to see what he was seeing, to understand the language of the dust and shadows that he was reading with such fluency. Suddenly he let out a low cry of triumph. "We have it!" He held up a small, glittering object between his thumb and forefinger. It was a woman's signet ring, made of a dark, unfamiliar metal that seemed to absorb the light. It was not gold or silver. The crest it bore was that of a noble house I did not recognize, but one that was clearly ancient, its sigil a complex knot of a serpent and a star. So he must have dropped it in his haste," I said, stating the obvious conclusion. "A woman. The murderer is a woman." "No, Vorn," Blackstone corrected, his voice sharp with impatience as he rose to his feet and pocketed the ring. "The murderer was a man. I've already deduced his height, which is far beyond that of a typical human female. The dust displaced by his knees when he knelt to check the victim's pulse confirms a significant body mass. This ring is a complication, an elegant one. Therefore, there was a second person involved, an accomplice, or the ring was stolen from a second, as yet undiscovered victim." He turned to the 2 enforcers, a flicker of a smile on his lips. "This case, gentlemen, is deepening beautifully." He cast one last sweeping glance around the room, as if committing every detail to an internal pic capture. "There's no more to be learned here," he announced. "I have all the data I require for my preliminary hypothesis. I will be in my quarters. Let me know if your conventional methods yield any results." And with that, he swept out of the room, leaving Proctor Valerius and Proctor Krieg standing in the flickering room, their faces a perfect portrait of bewildered frustration. I gave them a short, formal nod and followed my master. The journey back to our sanctum on Obscurus Lane was a quiet one. The Inquisitor seemed to have retreated back into that silent inner world of his. His long fingers steepled before his face as he stared unseeingly at the passing canyons of the Hive. The rhythmic clatter of the ground car's tracks was the only sound. I did not dare to interrupt his thoughts, knowing that some complex, extraordinary process was occurring behind those piercing eyes. It was not until we were seated back in our sitting room, a glass of amasec in my hand and Blackstone tending to one of his bubbling alchemical retorts, that I finally broke the silence. "You have solved it," I stated, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. "You know who did this?" "I know the how," he corrected, his back to me as he added a single drop of a glowing viscous fluid to the retort. "The who and the why are still coalescing, but the data is all there, Vorn. The crime scene was a book, and every grain of dust was a word. I simply have to arrange them in the correct order." "Then tell me," I pressed, "how could you be so certain about the poison? Even with my Medicaid training, I saw nothing conclusive." "The same way I deduced you had been in the Damocles Gulf," he said patiently, still not turning around. "Through logic and observation. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories, instead of theories to suit facts. The facts of the body were clear. No wound, but blood present. A rictus of absolute terror. Signs of a struggle, but no major disarray. The petechial hemorrhaging. It all points to a forced ingestion of a fast-acting and likely exotic neurotoxin that causes systemic cardiac shock. A poison that kills with fear. The rest, the height of the killer, the brand of his ILO stick, the faulty hydraulic stabilizer on his ground car, was simply a matter of observing what was there, instead of what one expected to be there. The enforcers expected a cultist, so they saw only a glyph. They are blind." "And the bloody glyph on the wall?" I asked, still trying to piece together the torrent of information he had just unleashed. "You said it was a distraction, a feint. A clever one," he said, turning from his experiment to finally face me, his eyes gleaming. "Extremely clever. The glyph is a minor sigil of vengeance, known to perhaps a dozen petty death cults in the lower Hive, specifically the Sanguine Covenant of Sector Delta 5. Their methods are well documented in the Ordo Hereticus archives. They are frenzied, ritualistic. Their killings are messy, passionate affairs, involving sacrificial blades and extensive post-mortem mutilation. They are animals, Vorn, not artists." He began to pace the room, his long strides eating up the space. But this was a work of art. It was cold, precise, and silent. There was no ritual, only an execution. The killer chose that specific glyph precisely because he knew your unimaginative enforcers would see it and immediately begin a pointless and time-consuming purge of known cultist dens. Proctor Krieg is, at this very moment, kicking in the doors of some gangers and death worshippers, rounding up the usual rabble. He's chasing a ghost of the killer's own creation, a ghost designed to give our true culprit time. "So the killer has no connection to the Sanguine Coven?" I asked. "None whatsoever, beyond a scholar's knowledge of their practices. He is an intellectual, a man who understands not only how to kill, but how to manipulate the very systems of justice designed to hunt him. A rare and fascinating specimen." A predatory hunger entered his voice. But he made a mistake. A single, small human error, born of haste and emotion. He produced the dark metal ring from his pocket and placed it on the table between us, in the dim light of the sanctum. It seemed to drink the shadows. He returned to the scene for this. He risked capture. He risked leaving a trail, all to retrieve this trinket. Therefore, it is not merely a trinket. It is an object of immense sentimental or perhaps political value. He will try to get it back. "And what will you do?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "I have already done it," Blackstone said, gesturing to his data slate. "I have sent a message to be broadcast on the public's Voxnet, across all mid-spire sectors. It will begin airing on the next cycle." He showed me the screen. The message read, "Found at the scene of the incident in the Lauriston tenements, one lady's signet ring, bearing the crest of a fallen house. The owner may reclaim it by presenting themselves to Acolyte K. Vorn at Sanctum 221B Obscurus Lane, before the 22nd hour." My blood ran cold. He had used my name. I was not merely his chronicler. I was now part of the mechanism of his trap. "But the murderer will see this," I cried. "He will know you have it. He will know we are onto him." "Of course," my companion replied, a thin predatory smile on his face. He leaned back in his chair, the flickering lumen light casting his hawk-like features in stark relief.
That is the entire point. Proctors Valerius and Krieg are hunting in the dark with shock mauls and brute force, hoping to beat a confession out of some pathetic sumpganger. They are fighting a war of attrition. He picked up the ring, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. I, on the other hand, am fighting a war of intellect. Our quarry is intelligent. He is patient, but he is also desperate. That ring is his one weakness, the single emotional lever in his otherwise logical game. I'm not merely waiting for him to come to me. I am forcing his hand. I am baiting a trap with the one thing I know the killer cannot afford to lose. I stared at him, a profound sense of awe and terror washing over me. In the endless brutal war for the soul of the Imperium, I had seen the power of bolt gun and chainsword. I was now beginning to understand the power of a single brilliant and utterly ruthless mind. I was no longer a soldier in the Emperor's Guard. I was a pawn in the games of a master, and the hunt had truly begun.
My companion's advertisement appeared on the public Voxnet that very evening cycle. I listened to it crackle to life from a commercial broadcaster, the announcer's slick, syrupy voice a bizarre vessel for our grim message. It was a simple statement, a baited hook cast into the data stream of 1 billion souls, and we could but wait to see what monstrous thing would bite. My confidence in the Inquisitor's methods was growing, but I was far from grasping the full scope of his intellect. He seemed to read the soul of the Hive itself, tracing the ghost trails of data and motive that were invisible to all others. For my part, I spent the next cycle in a state of high alert. I patrolled the sitting room of our sanctum, my las pistol freshly oiled and resting on the table beside my chair. Every chime of the door servitor, every distant shout from the transitway below, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I was the bait, my name broadcast across the spire. I felt exposed, a target in a city of predators. Blackstone, however, was the very picture of detached calm. He had retired to his alchemical bench and was soon producing a series of vile and pungent odors that spoke of some new esoteric experiment. He seemed to have dismissed the entire affair from his mind, completely absorbed in the delicate task of titrating a glowing green fluid into a beaker of what looked disturbingly like fresh blood. "Did you not think of the enforcers?" I asked at last, my nerves frayed by the waiting and the foul stench. "Will they not see this Vox ad and come to investigate, to interfere?" "They will see it," he replied, without looking up from his work, his eyepiece magnifier screwed into his socket. "And they will do nothing. They are floundering, Vorn. Baffled. They will grasp at any straw. They believe this to be my method, and they will wait, hoping I will fail so they might mock me, or that I will succeed so they might claim the credit." He held the beaker up to the lumen strip, observing the viscous liquid within swirl and smoke. "They are predictable. Our quarry, however, is not." The hours ticked by on the grand chrono on the wall, its movements slow and funereal. The endless roar of the hive city outside was a constant low-frequency hum, the breathing of a monstrous sleeping beast. I waited. Blackstone worked. The trap was set. Just as the 20th hour chime echoed from a distant spire cathedral, we heard the sound we had been waiting for. The sharp, electronic tone of the door servitor. I was on my feet in an instant, my hand on the grip of my las pistol, my heart hammering in my chest. Blackstone, however, remained perfectly calm, placing his beaker carefully in a stasis rack before gesturing for me to open the door. I did so, and a figure from the deepest sump seemed to have materialized in our hallway. It was an old woman, bent and wizened, her face a mask of wrinkles and grime, the skin pulled tight over her skull. She was wrapped in a ragged cloak that smelled of damp and decay, and her eyes, small and bright like a rat's, darted around the room, taking in every detail. She leaned heavily on a staff made from a polished piece of scrap metal. "The ring," she rasped, her voice like grinding rocks. "The Vox ad. It's my daughter's ring, her only heirloom. She lost it at the tenements. She is beside herself with grief." "And your daughter's name?" Blackstone asked, his voice smooth as polished stone, rising from his chair to greet the crone. "Kaina," the old woman croaked. She works in the lower manufactorums, sorting metal slag. A good girl, pious. It is all she has left of her mother, bless the Emperor's light." Her story was a common one in the Hive, a sad, believable tale of poverty and loss. I confess a pang of pity went through me. Blackstone smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "A sad story indeed, good mother,
and one that shall have a happy ending. He walked to a small, lead-lined coffer on his desk and opened it. He produced a ring, not the dark metal one from the crime scene, but a cheap, synth gold replica he had fabricated that afternoon while I had been pacing and worrying. Then she must have it back? Tell your Kaina that the Emperor protects the faithful. The old woman snatched the replica from his hand, her eyes gleaming with an avarice that seemed to momentarily burn through her performance of a grieving mother. She muttered a hasty, almost unintelligible thanks, and scurried out of the room, her metal staff tapping a hasty retreat down the corridor, disappearing back into the hive's endless dark. "Inquisitor," I cried, striding back from the door, "you let her go, and you gave her a fake. What madness is this?" "Precisely," Blackstone said, his eyes fixed on the window, his body tense as he watched the transitway below. "Because she was not an old woman. She was a young man, a trained actor, dosed with enough synth-wrinkled chems and a posture harness to fool a lesser eye. Did you not observe the smoothness of the skin on her neck, where the chems had been poorly applied? The firmness of her step, which belied the tremors in her hand. The accent was a caricature, a spy noble's idea of how a sump dweller speaks. A clever performance, but a performance nonetheless. A pawn sent by our killer to test the trap." He grabbed a dark, heavy coat from its hook. "Stay here, Vorn. I will follow. If she is a pawn, she will lead me to the king." He was gone in an instant, a black-robed shadow disappearing down the corridor. I was left alone in the sanctum, the strange alchemical odors, his only lingering presence. The adrenaline of the confrontation drained away, leaving me with a profound sense of uselessness. I was the bait, but I was not permitted to join the hunt. I paced the room, my augmetic shoulder aching, my mind racing. I tried to read a tome on xenobiology, but the words were a meaningless scrawl. Every creak of the building, every distant wail of a siren made me jump. I was an acolyte, a servant of the holy orders of the Inquisition, yet I felt as helpless as I had been on that blood-soaked field on Daleth. I waited for what felt like an eternity. The grand chrono on the wall chimed the midnight cycle, its tones deep and funereal. Finally I heard the door to our sanctum slide open. Blackstone returned. His face was dark, his expression one of a cold, controlled fury I had not yet seen. He was not angry at the quarry, but at himself, at being outmaneuvered. He gave me the slip, he growled, throwing his coat onto a chair. The ground car the decoy entered was a common hive hauler. It lost itself in the chaos of the lower transit spine, a maze of unregistered tunnels and gang-run shortcuts. By the time I could requisition and enforce a patrol to block the exits, he was gone, vanished. He stood by the window, staring out at the hive. Our man is clever, more clever than I anticipated. He knew he might be followed. He was prepared. For the next few days, the Inquisitor was lost in one of his black moods, the silence in our sanctum broken only by the mournful drone of his catgut vial. He consumed no food, only a thin, nutrient-laced broth. He spoke to no one. He was processing, recalibrating his immense intellect, searching for the flaw in his own logic, the miscalculation that had allowed his prey to escape. Then one evening, the music stopped. He summoned me. "Vorn, I have need of my irregulars." I had heard him mention this force before, a network of spies and informants he had cultivated in the city's underbelly, his own private intelligence network that operated outside the rigid structure of the Adeptus Terra. He went to his desk and activated a hidden vox bead, speaking a single coded phrase into it. "The hunt is barren. I require new eyes." Less than an hour later, the door servitor chimed. I opened it to find a gaunt, wiry man standing in the corridor. He was clad in the patched, filthy rags of a sunk brunner, but his eyes were sharp and fiercely intelligent. This was Scab, the king of Blackstone's gutter scum network. He stepped inside, his presence seeming to soil the relative cleanliness of our sanctum. "You summoned me, my lord?" Scab said, his voice a low growl. He did not bow, but stood with the wary respect of a lesser predator in the presence of a greater one. "I did," said Blackstone, stepping forward into the light. "I have a task for your flock. I need a man found, the one who hired the decoy, the actor who came to this room 2 nights ago." He quickly described the decoy's appearance. He will have sought out a performer, likely in the lower hive districts where such skills can be bought for a handful of thrones. He will have paid well. Find me the actor, Scab. Find the actor, and he will lead you to the man who hired him. I want a name, a location. I want the ground car hauler. Scab listened intently, his eyes never leaving Blackstone's face. It will cost you, he said. The usual rate, Blackstone replied, and a bonus for speed. Scab grinned, a flash of yellowed teeth in the gloom. Consider it done, Lord. He turned and was gone as silently as he had arrived, a ghost returning to the shadows. 2 days passed, days of tense silence in which the Inquisitor rarely spoke, his mind clearly occupied with the intricate web he was weaving. He spent this time calibrating strange devices and consulting star charts that seemed to have little to do with our current predicament. On the third day, the door servitor chimed. It was Scab. He was not alone. Trailing behind him like a pack of starving canids was a dozen of the most ragged, filth-encrusted urchins I had ever seen. They were children of the sump, their faces old before their time, their eyes sharp with a feral intelligence that spoke of a life of constant survival. They stood silently in our hallway, their presence a stark, odorous intrusion, their gaze taking in every detail of our relatively opulent sanctum. They were Blackstone's irregulars, the unseen eyes and ears of the hive. The ground car hauler Inquisitor, Scab said, his voice a low growl. We found him. Traced the decoy actor to a sump den in sector Epsilon 12. The fool was flush with thrones and talking too much. He described the man who hired him. Scab spat a glob of something unpleasant onto the floor. I chose not to identify it. Name's Jekron Hall, an off-worlder from his accent. Works the mid-spire transit routes. A loner, keeps to himself, stubborn as a grox. He won't come up here for no one. Blackstone smiled, a true predator smile. He will come, he said. He tossed a small, heavy bag of thrones to Scab, who caught it with a practiced snatch. Your payment. Your agents are to remain nearby, in the shadows. When my quarry arrives, they will have a part to play. Scab nodded. The bag disappeared into his rags. As you command, Lord. He turned, and with a series of clicks and whistles I could not decipher, his pack of urchins melted away into the hive's dark corners. Blackstone turned to me, the hunt now reaching its final critical phase. Vorn, the time for observation is over. The time for action is at hand. Go down to the street level. Hail the first ground car hauler you see. Tell him you have a passenger with valuable cargo who needs transport to the upper spire docks. The pay is double the standard rate. If it is not our man, dismiss him and try again. Sooner or later, greed will bring him to our door. I took a deep breath, my heart beginning to hammer a familiar pre-combat rhythm against my ribs. I was no longer a chronicler. I was an agent, a lure. I descended in the rattling lift cage to the street level, the air growing thick and heavy with the hive's foul breath. I stood at the edge of the transitway, the endless river of vehicles and humanity flowing past me in a blur of smog and desperation. I hailed the first hauler. He was a corpulent man with a greasy moustache, his cab reeking of stale Idaho sticks and unwashed flesh. Not our man. I dismissed him with a few scrip for his trouble. The second had the feral, chem-addled face of a Juve. Not him either. I waited, the acid rain beginning to hiss on the ferrocrete around me. Then a third ground car hauler pulled to a stop. It was a rugged, battered vehicle, its engine coughing black smoke. And behind the controls was a man who matched Scab's description perfectly. He was a rugged, powerfully built man with a grim, sun-scorched face that spoke of years spent on worlds with actual suns. His eyes were hard, and they watched me with a wary intelligence. "You need a hauler?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "I do," I replied, trying to keep my own voice steady. "To the upper spire docks, a delicate matter. The pay is double the standard rate, and a bonus for discretion." His eyes lit up with a flicker of greed, the universal language of the hive. "Get in," he said, "but your passenger best be ready. I ain't waiting." "He will be down in a moment," I said, opening the door to our building's grim entryway. "Just help me with his crate. It is heavy." He grumbled, but the promise of extra thrones was too much to resist. He swung himself down from the driver's seat and followed me into the dark, echoing lobby. As he stepped inside, I saw shadows detaching themselves from the deeper gloom of the alleyways across the transitway. Scab's urchins were in position. As the hauler looked around for the crate, Inquisitor Blackstone himself descended the stairs, his steps slow, deliberate, and silent. "Jackrin Hall," the Inquisitor said, his voice like a death knell in the sudden quiet of the lobby. "You are my prisoner." In an instant, the hauler's face contorted with a snarl of pure animal rage. He was impossibly fast. He lunged, not at Blackstone, but at me, the closest threat. I was ready for him. My old training from the guard screamed through my nerves. I sidestepped his charge and brought my last pistol butt down hard on his wrist. He roared in pain, but was immensely strong, his other hand grabbing my tunic and throwing me aside as if I were a child. He bolted for the door, a cornered beast seeking escape, but he was met by a swarm of Scab's urchins, who threw themselves at his legs with the ferocity of starving rats, clinging to him, biting and scratching. Blackstone was upon him in a flash. There was the sharp metallic click of a magnetic manacle locking on the hauler's wrist, and another onto his ankle. The man thrashed and cursed, a whirlwind of desperate violence, but he was trapped, brought down by the combined weight of the children of the sump. "We have him," Blackstone cried, his face flushed with the thrill of the hunt. He turned to the doorway, where, as if on cue, Proctors Valerius and Krieg were arriving, their expressions a mask of utter confusion. "My Lord Inquisitor, what in the name of the Lex is the meaning of this?" Valerius demanded, his hand on his bolt pistol. Blackstone bowed elegantly, his composure absolute. "A simple matter of civic duty, Proctor," he said, gesturing to the captured, snarling man on the floor. "Allow me to introduce you to the murderer of Lord Enoch Van der Est." The two Proctor enforcers stared at the scene before them in stunned silence. The captive, Jackrin Hall, snarled and thrashed against his magnetic manacles, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost tangible. Valerius was the first to find his voice. "My Lord Inquisitor, this is the murderer? A common ground car hauler? It is impossible." "Impossibility is the native state of the heretic, Proctor," Blackstone replied calmly. He produced a small silver tool from his robes and, with a surgeon's precision, pried open the prisoner's mouth. With a sharp twist he extracted a false tooth, and of the assassin he held it up. A tiny crystalline phial sac was embedded within, its contents glowing with a faint, sickly light. The same neurotoxin that killed Lord Van der Est. He would have taken his own life rather than be interrogated, a professional precaution. The prisoner spat a glob of bloody saliva onto the floor. "My life is already forfeit," he rumbled, "but I have done what I came to do. My vow is fulfilled." "A vow of vengeance," Blackstone stated, his voice a low whisper. He turned to the enforcers. "You have been chasing cult signs and hive gangs. You have been looking for a motive of greed or faith. You have been wrong. The motive here is not heresy, it is revenge. The glyph on the wall was not a symbol, but a word, an ancient Gothic word, for that very thing." He gestured for me to activate the interrogation servitor and its pic recorder. The machine glided forward on silent tracks, its single red optical lens focusing on the captive. "Now, Jackrin Hall, you will tell us your story, from the beginning." The prisoner looked from Blackstone's cold analytical eyes to the stern faces of the enforcers, and then to me. A look of profound weariness settled over him, the fire in his eyes banking to embers. "You have me," he rumbled. "The Emperor's justice can have my corpse. But my story is my own." "Then tell it," Blackstone commanded. And so he did. What follows is the story of Jackrin Hall, transcribed from the pic log of his own confession, a tale of faith, betrayal, and a vow of vengeance that spanned a segmentum. Our story begins not in the smog-choked spires of Hive Sibellus, but decades earlier and half a galaxy away, on a barren, forgotten death world on the eastern fringe. A world of red dust, jagged rock, and a sky the color of rust. A world where the very air is a corrosive whisper that scours flesh from bone. There a lone prospector named Jagar and his young adopted daughter Lyra were dying. They were the sole survivors of a pilgrim vessel, the Saint's Mercy, that had been ripped from the warp by a sudden violent Imperium storm. Their escape pod had brought them to this nameless world, a tiny flicker of humanity in an ocean of desolation. For weeks they had wandered, their water gone, their nutrient paste exhausted. They lay now in the shadow of a rock formation that looked like a screaming skull, waiting for the Emperor's peace. But it was not the Emperor who found them. It was a procession. A great train of armored crawlers and robed figures, materializing from the shimmering heat haze of the desert. Their faces were hidden by sand goggles and heavy rebreathers. They were the children of the Saint, a lost sect of the Imperial Creed who, generations ago, had fled persecution on a decadent Hive world. Their ship, like Jagars, cast into the unknown by the cruel whims of the warp. They had crash-landed on this world, and through sheer fanatical will, had not only survived, but endured. Their leader was a man they called the Prophet Militant Enoch, a charismatic and ruthless patriarch who ruled his flock with an iron fist. He saw the dying prospector and the girl, his eyes like black chips of obsidian peering out from his robed hood. He declared it a sign, a test of their faith from the God Emperor. They were taken in, nursed back to health with bitter-tasting recycled water and protein gruel, and brought to the pilgrim's hidden home. It was a new city carved from the living rock of a massive flat-top mesa, a sanctuary they called Salvation's Reach. It was a marvel of grim determination. A society of survivors built from the scavenged hull plates of their crashed vessel and fueled by an unshakable fanatical faith. Every aspect of life was dictated by the Prophet's interpretation of the Imperial Creed, a harsh, unforgiving doctrine of toil, piety, and absolute obedience. Jagar, with his deep knowledge of architect gleaned from a life of prospecting on dead worlds, became a valued, if mistrusted, member of the community. He was put to work in the great reclamation forges, his skills essential in coaxing life back into the scavenged and sanctified machinery that kept the city running. His daughter Lyra grew from a frightened child into a beautiful and spirited young woman, her vibrancy a stark and perhaps dangerous contrast to the dour, hard-bitten people of the Reach. In a society that valued grim duty above all else, her laughter was a small, treasured heresy. It was in the bustling makeshift markets of the city that she met a young hunter, a man who had been born in the wastes and knew the ways of the Red Desert. He was one of the few permitted to leave the city walls, his function to hunt the mutated creatures of the wastes for protein and to scout for new resource deposits. The hunter was Jekron Hall. The two fell in love, a rare and genuine warmth in a cold and unforgiving world. In the stolen moments between his long hunts and her duties in the hydroponic domes, they spoke of other worlds, of stars, of a life beyond the Prophet's suffocating gaze. They pledged themselves to each other in secret, a silent vow made under the strange alien moons, and planned to ask for the Prophet's blessing to be bonded. But the Prophet Enoch had other plans. His was a closed society, a grand and terrible experiment in human endurance, and he used marriage as a tool to consolidate power and maintain the purity of the founding bloodlines. He had two sons of the founding council, men of influence and wealth, who had yet to take wives. A man named Enoch Vanderest, son of one of the Prophet's most zealous lieutenants, and another, Jorik Stain, whose father controlled the city's water reclamation systems. The Prophet summoned Jagar to his sanctum, at the very peak of the mesa, a chamber carved from a single massive geode that glittered with a cold inner light. The Prophet sat upon a throne made from the command chair of the crashed pilgrim vessel, the Aquila still visible, though tarnished and scarred. The girl is of age, the Prophet declared, his voice a low rumble that echoed in the crystal chamber. She is a child of the Emperor's divine providence, a sign granted to us. She will strengthen our community. It is the Emperor's will that she be bonded to a son of the founding. Jagar, a man who had survived the void and the desert, stood unbowed. My daughter will choose her own path, he stated, his voice steady. The Prophet's eyes narrowed. There is only one path here, Prospector. The path I have laid. The girl will choose, Vanderest or Stain. She has 1 month. His voice dropped, becoming as cold and hard as the crystals around them. If a choice is not made by the next full moon, the Emperor's judgment will be severe. My penitent guard will see to it. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, settled over Jagar's Hab unit. The two suitors began their grim courtship. Vanderest was arrogant and cruel, his wealth a weapon he used to try and buy Lyra's affection. Jorik Stain was sly and silent, his gaze like that of a patient predator, always watching from the shadows. Both filled Lyra with a profound dread. Jekron Hall, now forbidden from seeing her, could only watch from afar, his heart filled with a helpless, burning rage. He knew, as did Jagar, that there was no future for them in salvation's reach. The prophet's word was law, and his law was death. Their only hope was to escape, to flee back into the desolate wastes and pray they could survive long enough to find passage off-world. For weeks Jekron secretly gathered supplies. By day he performed his duties as a hunter, but his mind was a whirlwind of calculation and planning. He bartered in the shadowy corners of the city's market, trading the rare pelts of desert predators for things that would not be missed. A handful of high-yield power packs for his las rifle, neutron bars dense enough to sustain a man for a full cycle, a worn but functional water purifier. Every transaction was a risk. The eyes of the penitent guard were everywhere, and any sign of stockpiling would be seen as an act of sedition. He spent his nights in the archives of the city's founding, studying the ancient scavenged star charts from the crashed vessel. He was no navigator, but he was a hunter. He knew how to read the land, and he learned to read the alien stars. He mapped a route through the treacherous canyons of the Great Mesa, a path known only to the first settlers, a path long since abandoned as too dangerous. It was their only hope. The night before the month was up, under the dim light of a sickly green twin moon, Jekron Hall met Jagar and Lyra at a hidden maintenance gate at the base of the mesa, a place where the city's waste was discharged into the canyons below. The stench was overpowering, but it masked their scent from any watch beasts. Jagar carried a single heavy pack. Lyra clutched a small leather-bound book, the only possession she had from her life before the crash. With a final fearful look back at the city that had been their salvation and was now their prison, the three of them slipped into the unending hostile darkness of the Great Red Desert. They were free, but they were also hunted. What follows is a chronicle of a desperate flight across a world that did not tolerate life. For days they traveled, navigating by the strange alien constellations that glittered like shards of glass in the rust-colored sky. The days were a furnace that baked the moisture from their bodies, the nights a frozen hell that left a rime of frost on their ragged cloaks. They saw things in the wastes that defied sanity, skittering multi-limbed creatures that hunted in the twilight, their chitinous bodies blending perfectly with the rocks, and strange glassy flora that pulsed with an inner light, humming a tune that made the teeth ache. They rationed their supplies with grim discipline, but the desert was a patient and unforgiving enemy. On the 10th cycle of their flight, Jagar collapsed. The hardships of the journey had worn his aging body down to the bone. He lay in the shallow shade of a rock outcropping, his mind lost in a fever dream, muttering of crowded spires and acid rain from a life lived in a galaxy away. Jekron and Lyra did what they could, forcing drops of precious water between his cracked lips, but the old man's strength was gone. He died at dawn, his last breath a rattling sigh that was swept away by the ever-present wind. They buried him under a cairn of red rocks, a task that took them hours, their hands raw and bleeding from scraping at the hard, unforgiving ground. Lyra's grief was a silent, terrible thing. She did not weep. She stared at the grave, her face a mask of stone, and a part of the vibrant, spirited girl Jekron had known died with her father, buried forever under the rust-red desert of that nameless world. As Jekron placed the final rock upon the grave, she looked up at him, her eyes as hard and unforgiving as the desert around them. "We keep moving," she said, her voice a dry whisper, and so they did. They pushed on, now just the two of them, their hope dwindling with every step. The silence between them was as vast and empty as the desert itself, a space that had once been filled with the quiet wisdom of Jagar. Lyra's grief had forged her into something hard and brittle. She moved with a grim, mechanical efficiency, her face a mask of dust and determination. The vibrant, spirited girl Jekron had loved was gone, replaced by a survivor, a creature of the wastes, as tough and unforgiving as the landscape itself. The goal was a distant mountain range, a dark smudge on the horizon that shimmered in the heat haze. Jekron knew of hidden springs and caves within those mountains, a place where they could rest, recover, and perhaps, just perhaps, survive. But the desert guarded its secrets jealously. The creatures grew larger, more aggressive, the further they traveled from the relative safety of the mesa. They spent their nights huddled in shallow caves, listening to the alien chittering of unseen things that hunted in the dark. Jekron's las rifle a constant, comforting weight in his hands. They were within a day's march of the mountains, the dark peaks finally beginning to resolve into individual crags and canyons when disaster struck. Jekrin, scouting ahead through a narrow, winding canyon, felt a tremor in the ground beneath his feet. He froze, his hunter's instinct screaming that something was wrong. The air was still. The usual whisper of the corrosive wind had died away. It was a predatory silence. The dust at his feet erupted. A cinder lurk, a scaled beast that hunted beneath the surface, burst from the ground in a shower of rock and sand. It was a nightmare of chitin and claws, its hide the color of burnt iron, its multiple beady eyes burning with a cold alien intelligence. He had no time to aim, only to react. He brought his las rifle up and fired a desperate point-blank blast that caught the creature in the torso, filling the canyon with the stench of vaporized Xenos flesh and superheated rock. The beast shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and thrashed in its death throes. But in its final convulsive movement, one of its venomous claws lashed out, tearing a deep, bleeding gash across his leg, from knee to ankle. The pain was white-hot fire. He screamed, stumbling back, the world tilting on its axis. He could already feel the potent neurotoxin beginning its work, a cold numbness spreading from the wound, followed by a fire that seemed to burn in his very veins. He knew he had only minutes. He managed to stagger back to their small camp at the mouth of the canyon, his vision blurring, his leg a dead weight that refused to obey his commands. He collapsed at Lyra's feet, his body convulsing, the rust-red dust of the desert rising up to meet him. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Lyra's terrified face, her eyes wide not with despair, but with a terrible, unwavering resolve. When he awoke, he was alone. The fire in his leg was gone, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. The world was a blur of pain and confusion. He pushed himself up on his elbows. The wound on his leg had been crudely but effectively cauterized, the flesh blackened and sealed with the superheated power pack from his own las rifle. It was dressed with a clean strip of cloth torn from her cloak. Besides him, in a neat pile, lay the last of their nutrient bars and their only full water skin. Lyra was gone. He called her name, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. The only answer was the mournful howl of the wind through the canyon. He looked down. Scrawled in the red dust beside him, drawn with a trembling finger, was a single word: forgive. And in that moment he knew what she had done. To save him from a death by venom, a death that was now minutes away for her, she had walked back to salvation's reach. She had given herself up to the prophet to pay for his life. She had traded her future for his. For weeks, Jekrin was lost in a haze of venom, grief, and rage so profound it burned away all other thought. He survived on pure animal instinct. The desert that had nearly killed him was now his sanctuary, its harsh realities a welcome distraction from the inferno in his soul. He hunted the desert's lesser creatures, his skills honed to a razor's edge. He learned the patterns of the corrosive winds and the whispers of the shifting sands. He became a creature of the wastes, a ghost of a man, his heart a cold, hard knot of hatred in his chest. The memory of Lyra's face, her eyes filled with that terrible resolve, was the fuel that kept him alive. When his strength had finally returned, and the last of the Xenos venom had been purged from his system, he had only one purpose. He made his way back across the desert, no longer a desperate fugitive, but a predator returning to his hunting grounds. He did not approach Salvation's Reach from the main gate, but from the treacherous, unscalable cliffs on the western mesa. He scaled the sheer rock face under the cover of a blinding dust storm, moving with the skill and silence of a native hunter, his hands and feet finding purchase in cracks and fissures that no city dweller would have ever seen. He slipped back into the city unnoticed, a phantom returning to a life he had left behind. He found the place changed. The prophet's rule, once merely absolute, had become paranoid. The penitent guard were everywhere, their faces grim and watchful, their presence a constant suffocating reminder of the city's iron-fisted law. He lived in the shadows, in the forgotten maintenance tunnels and abandoned cisterns beneath the city, emerging only at night to listen, to watch, to learn. He learned the truth from a hushed, terrified conversation between two old artisans in a darkened workshop, their words whispered over a sputtering Prometheum lamp. Lyra had been married. She was now the bonded wife of Enoch van der Est, the prophet's eldest son, the same arrogant and cruel man who had first laid claim to her. The artisans spoke of a grand public ceremony, a celebration of unity and the strength of the founding bloodlines. They did not speak of the look in the bride's eyes. From that moment, Jekrin became a ghost in the city, his only purpose to catch a glimpse of the woman he had lost. He watched Van der Rest's opulent hab unit from a distant, crumbling spire, learning the routines of his household guards, waiting for his chance. He saw her only once. She was walking in a guarded garden on the hab unit's highest terrace, a small, sad splash of green in a city of red rock and grey metal. She was walking with Van der Rest, who strode beside her, his hand on her arm, his expression one of smug ownership. The vibrant, spirited girl Jekren had loved, the girl who had laughed in the face of a dying world, was gone. In her place was a pale, silent woman with dead eyes who walked with the slow, shuffling gait of a servitor, her spirit crushed under the weight of her gilded cage. The sight of her broke what was left of Jekren's heart and forged his hatred into a blade of pure, cold adamantium. He watched until they had gone back inside. Then he slipped away back into the shadows, his soul a cold, dark void. He made a vow that day, a solemn oath sworn on the memory of her father's lonely grave. He would not just have revenge on Enoch Van der Rest, he would have it on Jorik Steyn as well, the other suitor who had been a party to his beloved's damnation. He would hunt them. He would follow them across the stars if he had to. He would be their doom, and he would not rest until his vow was fulfilled, and their debt was paid in blood. Jekren Hall was now a man possessed. His life, which had once been a simple cycle of survival in the wastes, was now a complex and patient game of observation and waiting. He learned the guard rotations of the penitent guard, the delivery schedules of the nutrient vats, the blind spots in the watchtower's auspex grids. He was a phantom in the city's underpassages, his hatred a cold, sharp stone in his belly. He watched as the months turned into a year. He watched as Lyra, the woman he loved, faded like a ghost within the walls of her prison. Her health, broken by her grief and her flight in the desert, failed her completely. In the fanatical society of Salvation's Reach, there was no Mordecai law for a broken heart, no Kyrogan's tool for a shattered soul. She refused food. She grew thin and pale, a wraith haunted by the memory of her father and the life she had lost. Van der Rest, her husband, tired of his sullen and wasting bride, left her to the care of the Mordecai servitors, his own time spent in the pursuit of wealth and power within the Prophet's council. Lyra died in the depths of the long winter cycle. Jekren learned of it when he saw the black funeral banners, bearing the crest of Van der Rest's house, being hung from the walls of the great temple. The Prophet Enoch himself delivered a grand sermon on the piousness and obedience of the girl who had been saved from the wastes, only to be granted the Emperor's peace in the heart of the faithful. It was a masterpiece of hypocrisy, a final brutal insult to her memory. That night Jekren acted. His grief had been burned away, leaving only the cold, pure metal of his rage. He scaled the walls to Van der Rest's hab unit, his movements swift and silent, a predator closing in for the kill. He slipped past the outer guards, his mono knife a sliver of darkness in his hand. He was in the gardens, the same place he had last seen Lyra, when an alarm shrieked through the night. He had tripped a hidden pressure plate. The penitent guard were on him in an instant, a tide of black-robed zealots with shock mauls and auto-pistols. The fight was a blur of desperate, savage violence. Jekren was a hunter, and he fought like a cornered animal. He killed 2 of the guards, his knife a whirlwind of vengeful steel, but he was outnumbered. A shot from an auto-pistol grazed his side, a burning line of pain. He knew he could not win, he could only escape. He threw himself over the edge of the terrace, falling 10 meters into the darkness of the lower city, his fall broken by the canvas roof of a market stall. He fled, the hue and cry of the guard behind him, a wounded wolf escaping the pack. He knew he could never return to Salvation's Reach. His identity was known. He was a hunted man. He fled back into the great red desert, the place of his birth. Wounded with no supplies, he should have died, but his vow was a fire in his belly that would not let him perish. He survived, and began the long, impossible journey to the other side of the planet, to a place he had only heard of in whispers, a lawless landing field used by smugglers, rogue prospectors, and those seeking to escape the Prophet's iron rule. It took him a year of living like a beast, of drinking foul water from hidden springs, of eating things that would have killed lesser men. He arrived at the landing field a gaunt, scarred, and haunted figure, his eyes burning with a cold, unwavering light. He sold the only thing of value he had, a nugget of pure archaeocrystal he had found in the wastes, for passage on a tramp freighter bound for the Calixus sector. As the ship clawed its way into the void, Jekren Hall stood at a grimy viewport, looking down at the rust-red world that had been his home and his hell. It grew smaller and smaller, a bloody tear in the black velvet of space. He had lost everything on that world. His father, his love, his life. But he had found a new purpose. He was no longer a hunter of beasts, he was a hunter of men, and his hunt had just begun. Jekrenhal's tale then became one of a great and terrible odyssey. His confession shifted from the sharp, painful details of a single world to a sprawling, wary chronicle of a hunt that spanned 2 decades and a dozen star systems. He was no longer a youth driven by grief, but a hard, grim man, his soul honed to a single sharp point of purpose. He was an instrument of vengeance, and the galaxy was his hunting ground. His first challenge was learning the fate of his prey. He learned from hushed whispers among the Voidfarers at the lawless landing field that the Prophet Enoch's envoys, Vanderest and Stain, had abandoned their mission upon reaching the Calixis sector. They had sold the archaeotech they carried for an immense personal fortune and vanished into the teeming anonymous masses of the Imperium, severing all ties with their fanatical past. They had bought a new life with the treasures that had cost Lyra and her father everything. For the next 20 years the hunt continued. It was a slow, grinding pursuit that dragged Jekren through the darkest corners of the segmentum. He worked as a hired gun on the security crews of tramp freighters, the skills he had learned hunting beasts in the Red Desert proving brutally effective against void pirates and sump gangers. He spent 5 years as a sump prospector in the lightless depths of Hive Gloriana, sifting through the toxic sludge for salvageable tech, his ears always open for the whisper of a name. He told me of a time on the Forge World of Ryza where he worked as a menial laborer in the great weapons foundries, the air a searing torment of burning promethium and molten metal. He spent his nights in crowded data dens, bribing low-level adepts of the Administratum for access to shipping manifests and trade licenses, searching for the ghost trail of his 2 targets. He found a record of a Lord Vanderest purchasing luxury goods, but the trail went cold, the data corrupted. Their years bled into one another. The memory of Lyra's face, once a sharp, painful image that fueled his rage, began to fade, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of his vow. He was no longer a man seeking revenge for a lost love. He was the vow. It was the only thing that kept him sane in a galaxy of madness. It was his catechism, his prayer, his reason to draw breath each cycle. His break came in a dirty data den on the orbital station of Port Wonder, the great lawless gateway to the Coronis expanse. The air in the den was thick with the babble of 100 languages and the smell of stale recaf and ozone. He was following a cold lead, a rumor of a wealthy merchant who matched Vanderest's description. He found his source in a drunken chartist clerk, a man whose career had stalled, leaving him with a mind full of valuable secrets and a soul full of bitter resentment. For the price of a bottle of rare, aged Amasek, the clerk's tongue was loosened. He spoke of a wealthy off-worlder, a Lord Vanderest who had recently bought passage on a chartered vessel, a man who matched the description perfectly, a man who flaunted his wealth and spoke with contempt of his primitive faith-bound past. He was traveling to a hive world on the far side of the sector, a world known for its smog-choked spires and its endless anonymous crowds. A perfect place to disappear, a perfect place to hunt. The world was called Sibellus. Jekrenhal spent the last of his savings on a one-way ticket aboard a bulk freighter, traveling in the reeking, crowded holds with pilgrims and indentured laborers. He arrived in Hive Sibellus a month ago, a ghost from another life, a man with a 20-year-old debt to collect. He took a job as a ground car hauler, a perfect cover that allowed him to learn the city's arteries, to listen to its whispers, to hunt. It did not take him long to find Enoch Vanderest. The man was living in a spire hab, enjoying the fruits of his treachery. The hunt was almost over. All that was left was the final, bloody payment. What follows is Jekrenhal's account of the first execution. His voice, when he spoke of it, was devoid of emotion, a flat, toneless recitation of a task long planned and clinically performed. He began to stalk his first target. His job as a ground car hauler was the perfect cover. It made him invisible, just another nameless face in the endless river of transit, another cog in the Hive's great machine. For a week he learned Enoch Vanderest's habits, the decadent spire bars he frequented, the company of sycophants he kept, the late hours he returned to his hab unit, his senses dulled by Amasek. Harl watched and waited, his patience a cold, hard thing forged in the red desert of a dead world. His opportunity came on a night thick with acid rain that hissed and steamed on the hot ferrocrete of the transitways. Van der Rest, now corpulent and red-faced from years of indulgence, was physically ejected from a high spire establishment called the Emperor's Grace, after a loud and violent dispute over a gambling debt. He stood swaying in the rain, cursing, his fine jewel-toned robes soaked in gutter filth. Hull pulled his ground cart to the curb, the vehicle's battered hull a stark contrast to the gleaming skimmers of the spire nobles. "Need a ride, Lord?" he rumbled, his face hidden in the deep shadows of the cockpit. Van der Rest, too intoxicated and enraged to notice or care who was driving, stumbled in, barking the address of his spire hab. Hull nodded, and the ground car lurched into the flow of traffic. He drove, not towards the glittering peaks of the spire, but down, spiraling down into the decaying, forgotten levels of the Hive, towards the abandoned Lauriston tenements. "What is this?" Van der Rest slurred, finally noticing the change in scenery as the opulent facades of the spire gave way to the brutal, crumbling architecture of the lower levels. "This isn't my spire." "No," Hull said, bringing the vehicle to a halt in the courtyard of an empty hab block. He turned to face his passenger, the flickering lights of the transitway casting his scarred face in a grim tableau. "It is not." Recognition and then terror dawned in Van der Rest's eyes. He fumbled for a sidearm, but Hull was faster, his hand a steel clamp on the nobleman's wrist. "Do you know who I am?" Hull asked, his voice a low whisper of pure venom. Van der Rest, his face pale and sweating, shook his head. "I am the man whose life you destroyed. I am the ghost of Jaeger and the vengeance of Lyra." Hull produced a small, ornate box from his coat. Inside, nestled in synth velvet, were 2 identical unmarked phials, each containing a single dose of clear liquid. "This is the justice of the wastes," Van der Rest, Hull explained, his voice calm and terrible. "The prophet you serve taught us that the Emperor tests us with trials of fate. Here is yours. One of these phials contains a harmless nutrient grog, the other a neurotoxin so potent it will stop your heart before you can scream. You will choose one, you will drink it, and you will face the Emperor's judgment, just as Lyra faced yours." Van der Rest, in his drunken terror, babbled and pleaded, but Hull's face was a mask of stone. Finally, with a desperate sob, the nobleman snatched one of the phials from the box and drained its contents. For a moment there was silence. Then Van der Rest's eyes went wide, his body convulsed, and he collapsed, his face frozen in the same mask of absolute terror that Blackstone and I had seen on his corpse. His death was swift, silent, and horrifying. Jekron Hull, his heart pounding with the ecstatic, terrible triumph of his fulfilled vow, dragged the body into the empty hab unit. He had planned to take the man's wealth, but in that moment, thrones and script seemed a petty and meaningless thing. In his haste and excitement, he did not notice that the signet ring he had made for Lyra, the ring he had carried for 20 years as a holy relic, had slipped from the pouch around his neck. With Van der Rest's blood, he scrawled the ancient Gothic word for vengeance upon the wall. His work was half done. He knew the enforcers would now be hunting him, a ghost with a name, but he could not leave Hive Sibellus, not yet. His vow was not yet fulfilled. Jorik Stein was still alive. Hull returned to the teeming anonymity of the lower mid-spire. He knew he needed to find Stein, and quickly. He thought of the Inquisitor's network, the feral, intelligent urchins who saw everything. Using the last of the thrones he had taken from Van der Rest's body, he sought out one of Scab's runners in a crowded sump market. He did not know the boy answered to Blackstone. He only knew that the urchins of the Hive were the most efficient information brokers a man could buy. He described Stein, gave the boy the last known location of Van der Rest's spire hab, and promised a rich reward for the location of his associate. The urchin, his eyes wide with the promise of more coin than he had ever seen, was back within a single cycle. The news was grim. Jorik Stein, having heard of his partner's death on the public Voxnet, was packing in a panic, ready to flee. He was holed up in a cheap hostelry in the very sector Hull was using as his hideout. Hull went at once. He climbed the rust-eaten fire escapes to Stein's window on the hab block's upper floor. Inside, Stein was frantically throwing possessions into a crate. Hull entered through the window, a grim spectre of vengeance. Stein turned, his face a mask of terror, and drew a las pistol. The two men fought, a desperate, brutal struggle in the cramped, squalid room. Stein was a creature of ledgers and data slates, no match for a man forged in the crucible of a death world. The fight ended with Stein on the floor, Hull's monoknife buried in his heart. As the life drained from his eyes, Hull held the box with the remaining phial before him. He chose the poison, Hull whispered to the dying man. "Your choice is already made." He left the box of files on the table, a final, defiant message to his pursuers, and fled back into the anonymity of the Hive, his life's purpose complete. He had, he confessed, felt a profound sense of peace. He was a hauler with no cargo, a hunter with no prey. He was simply waiting for the end. It found him, as we know, in the form of my master. The prisoner's story was done. He sat back in his chair, a look of profound peace on his face. The weariness of 2 decades of hatred finally gone. He had expressed no remorse, only a grim satisfaction. He was ready, he said, to face the Emperor's justice. Proctor enforcers Valerius and Krieg, their faces pale, took him away. Their simple case of murder now a complex and tragic epic that spanned half the galaxy. Inquisitor Blackstone and I were left alone in the sanctum. The next day, I was perusing the public voxnet when an article caught my eye. It was an official report from the enforcers, detailing the successful resolution of the Vanderest Stain murders. It lauded the acumen and diligence of Proctors Valerius and Krieg, whose tireless investigation had brought the killer to justice. There was no mention of Inquisitor Mordecai Blackstone. I threw the data slate down in disgust. "See this, Inquisitor," I cried. "They have taken all the credit. Your name is not even mentioned." Blackstone smiled, his thin, cold smile. He was not angry. He was not even annoyed. He was simply content. "It is of no consequence," he said. "I have the data. The puzzle is solved. This is my reward. Let the enforcers have their promotions. Let them posture and preen. It is a distraction." He stood and looked out of the great window at the endless smog-choked spires of the Hive. "What you learn in this line of work, Acolyte," he said, his voice a low murmur, "is that there is a scarlet thread of heresy and vengeance running through the colourless skein of life, and our duty is to unravel it, and isolate it, and expose every inch of it." His words hung in the air, a perfect summary of his strange and terrible purpose, and as I looked at the vast, uncaring city outside, I knew that my own life, now bound to his, would be a study in that same terrible scarlet for all the years to come. This concludes the chronicle of my meeting with Inquisitor Blackstone. Further chronicles will be unsealed shortly. You may append your own approved commentary to the record below. The Autochronos is ever watchful.